You want to see my first attempt at a portrait? How bad do you think it is? Like 1 to 10. 3, 2. Hey, Shakabaras! My name is Jake. This is the Fireside Tattoo Network, and you are watching 3 Minutes to Better Tattooing. 3 minutes to better tattooing. So I put this episode together today of my very first attempt at a tattoo portrait. I should correct myself. I've done celebrity portraits, very stylized, strong light source, Elvis, Marilyn Monroe stuff years past, but I've never tried to do a portrait of for a memorial piece or of a loved one, in this case a grandparent. And I've got plenty of reasons for that, but I don't want to go into it in this episode. But what got me thinking and why I decided to do this is that I'm always kind of preaching about the Fireside Method and how this method of tattoo design that applies to all styles of tattooing. So if we start with shapes and then we move down to values and then we move to edges, and then the least important part of a tattoo is always color. So with that in mind, I thought, well, the same method, the same principles apply to portrait tattooing as they do any other style of tattooing. So if I'm always preaching that this method works for everything, then why shouldn't I be willing to give it a shot on a portrait? Plus, I had a client that wanted this portrait of his grandfather, and I wanted to be able to do that for him. So let me cut over here, and I'll show you. This is what we started with. This is the photo. Actually, it was in color. So the first thing that I did was I dropped it to black and gray, pulled it into Procreate, dropped it into black and gray, and I'm going to kind of go over my preparation first, and then I'll go through my execution. We'll try to do this quickly. So I dropped it to grayscale, and what you can see immediately is that all of the shadow shapes get flattened out, right? So what I did, my next step, was that I went through and I laid a basic map over the top of the portrait, just so that I could see what the shapes were, how they were falling, how they were receding and coming forward, what the basic shapes of his head were. So let me pull this off to the side, and I'll tell you, the reason that I do this is because, like I've always said, you don't solve a problem by making it more complex. And whenever you look at a portrait like this, there's so much information that you really want to solve the simplest problems first, and that's the problem of shape. We want to get the shapes down first, and then from shapes we want to get into value. So I did just a very quick kind of idea with the light coming straight at his head, which it seems to be. I did a very quick kind of rendering of what those shapes would be like if I abstracted them out into the most basic elements. And I'll tell you why I think it's important to do a simple map like I've done right here, just a breakdown of the basic shapes in the tattoo and then a quick kind of value study, is because you know how whenever you come up drawing, everyone tells you draw what you see. That's how you learn to draw. You draw what you see. And I heard that through high school and through art school and college, and I'm here to tell you that that is wrong. That's bad advice. We see what our conditioning allows us to see. So photography tends to flatten out shadow shapes. So everything that's dark, everything from an 8 to a 10 is just going to read as black. It's going to read as dark. But I know how light reveals form, right? So we're drawing based on a hybrid of what we see and what we know. And so if you know that when light hits this area, you have a light side, and then as it curves, you've got a halftone, and then as it continues to curve, you've got a form shadow, and then maybe you have some reflected light, and then maybe there's a cast shadow. So whether or not I can see that in a photograph, I typically can't, especially a photograph like this that doesn't have a super strong light. It doesn't have a strong light source with harsh cast shadows, which would make it a lot easier. Since it doesn't have that, I have to draw based on what I know to be true as well as what I'm looking at, right? So we're drawing a little bit from our previous education, our research, and the work that we put into learning how to draw things that look believable, and the actual imagery in front of us. And that's the way we should always be working. So after I mapped him out this way, I went through and I just started playing with different value studies, with different effects on different layers. So I went through and I did a halftone version. So I made it up all of dots, and that was a little bit too light. So then I went through and I did a secondary halftone. And what I found in Procreate is that actually this isn't a true halftone. It kind of cheats, and it puts these dots over the top of the photograph and just simplifies it a little bit. But it does the trick. What I'm trying to do is just get my simple light and dark shapes down. Just get an idea of from the basic structure of the head that I put together, What's the next step that kind of shows me the in-between from that very basic blocky structure of a head to something that looks a little bit more like this actual person? From that, I went ahead and I just made a stencil, which you can kind of see how I laid the stencil out, similar to the way that you would see most people lay out a stencil. Mine are fairly simple compared to a lot of the really high-level photorealism style tattooers. I don't like really complicated stencils. In fact, this was a little complicated for me, particularly when it got into the eyes and all that kind of stuff here. But anyways, that's the way that I put it together. And then I went through and I just took a 5 mag and I scrubbed in the basic shape with a very, very light wash. And the reason I did that is because I don't want to address edges just yet. And I definitely don't want to put some type of a hard mark where it's actually going to be a soft transition at the end of the tattoo. So I come in with a mag and I just kind of scrub those areas in just so that I don't lose my stencil, and it allows me to really refine my edges once I get to that phase of the tattoo. The next thing that I did is I just working in my medium and dark tones, I blocked in all of the shadow shapes. So some of those were true shadow shapes, and then some of them were just the areas that get a lot of blood flow, like nose and ears, that just appear a little bit darker just because they are redder. And red is if you were to show it in color, red is a little bit darker on the value scale. So I went through and I just found all of my darkest areas of the tattoo and I blocked it in, kind of trying to keep it as abstract as I could. I think one of the most important things is when doing realism. Of course, like I said before, I'm not a realism tattooer, but I draw and paint a lot of realism or believable type of work. And I think that the longer you can keep the image abstracted in your mind, where you're forgetting that it's a head, you're forgetting that it's lips, you're forgetting that it's, that it's an eyeball or that it's a pair of glasses, and you're just trying to think if it's a triangle or a rectangle or what kind of like abstract shape it is. The more you can keep that in your mind, or the longer you can keep that in mind, the more successful the tattoo will be. The problem comes whenever we start to think about tattooing lips. We get this idea of what lips look like in our mind, with this like kind of shape of the top lip and then a bottom lip. The fact is they don't ever look like that. The lips don't look the way that we think they do. And then the final thing that I did is I just went back in and I refined all of my edges. I started to address my light shape so that I only had my lightest lights in the area that I needed them, in the biggest kind of focal points. And that's what this is right here. And so this is the finished piece. And is it a, Bob Tyrrell, David Vega level portrait? Well, no, but that's what they do all day, every day. I think for my first attempt at a portrait, or at least my first attempt at a portrait of this style, I'm pretty happy with it. I saw it healed just the other day, and it settled in nicely. So that's it. I probably went over 3 minutes, but just real quickly to reiterate, if you focus on your shapes first, then your values, where's your contrast going to be? Squint your eyes down. What's dark? What's light? What's in between? Separate the overall dark families from the overall light families, and then refine down from there. Then go into your edges. Don't get too crazy and start outlining stuff too early in the process with this style of tattoo. You want to save those edges for the end of the tattoo. Just keep in mind that whenever you're making a hard line, it's one of your most powerful tools. It's one of the most kind of striking, attention-grabbing tools that we have. Like, hard lines are as strong a contrast as we have in tattooing. Bold lines are it. And so if you use those too early, then you don't get to really drive attention to those focal points later in the tattoo. So thank you, as always, for supporting what we do. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, give me one of the old thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one.